Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into something wild, how a single building renovation might just be shaking up the entire global economy. Seriously, let's get right into it. So picture this. It's mid-January 2026, and the markets are getting rattled. All of a sudden, the price of gold, that classic safe haven asset, just shoots up. We're talking past $4,600 an ounce, a first in history. And right at that exact same moment, the US dollar index, that's the DXY, which is basically a report card for how the dollar is doing against other major currencies, it tanks. You can see it right here. It's a perfect mirror image, right? People are basically sprinting away from the dollar and running straight to the safety of gold. Now, a shock of this size doesn't just happen out of the blue. Something big has to be going on. It points to a deep, deep crack right at the heart of the financial system. And that brings us to the central question we're going to explore. The answer, it lies in an event that is truly unprecedented in American history. And it involves one of the most powerful and what we thought was one of the most untouchable figures in the entire global economy. That's right. For the very first time, the sitting chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve is under a criminal investigation by his own government. As you can imagine, this news sent an absolute shockwave through the financial world. But Jerome Powell, he didn't just sit back and take it. Nope. He immediately went on the offensive. And he framed this thing not as a legal problem, but as a raw political power play. So what Powell is saying here is pretty explosive. He's basically calling the official story a total smokescreen. He's arguing that the real reason for all this heat is that he refused to play ball with the president's demands to cut interest rates. In his eyes, this isn't about a building. It's a direct assault on the Fed's independence. Okay, so what is this official story then? What's the pretext that Powell's talking about? It all circles back to the massive and massively over-budget renovation of the Fed's headquarters, right in Washington, D.C. Let's just follow the money for a second. If you look at this table, the project kicked off with a budget of $1.9 billion back in 2019. Okay, by 2025, the Fed's own estimate had jumped to $2.5 billion. But then, the White House comes out and says the real price tag is closer to a mind-boggling $4 billion. That massive gap is the official justification for this entire investigation. So why did the budget explode? Well, the Fed put out a whole list of reasons. They said they ran into all sorts of unexpected nightmares. Asbestos, lead, even toxic soil. On top of that, they're dealing with record-high costs for things like steel and cement. And they even had to fire their first architecture firm. I mean, it was just the perfect storm for cost overruns. But really, this whole argument over construction costs is just a cover. It's a proxy war for a much, much bigger fight. One that gets to the very core of how modern economies are supposed to work. And it's all about this idea of central bank independence. The whole point is to create a firewall, right? To keep politicians, who are naturally focused on winning the next election, from meddling. You don't want them forcing the central bank to pump up the economy for a short-term boost, because that could lead to absolutely disastrous inflation later on. This timeline really puts it all into perspective. I mean, this criminal probe, it didn't just pop up out of thin air. It came after months and months of the president just relentlessly attacking Powell in public, getting more and more frustrated that he wouldn't cut interest rates. The insults got really personal, too, going from calling him a stubborn moron to a clown. Now, a power struggle like this in the U.S. doesn't just stay in the U.S. Oh, no. It sent tremors all through the global financial system. It forced other countries to sit up, pay attention, and start making new plans. Plans for a world where maybe they don't have to depend on America so much. And get this, in a move you almost never see, the central banks from 10 of America's closest allies got together and put out a joint statement. They voiced their full solidarity with Powell, and they called independence a cornerstone of stability. It was a very clear, coordinated message to the White House that was basically saying, hey, you are playing with fire here. But one country's crisis is another's opportunity. For a lot of other global players, all this internal chaos in the U.S. is a green light. It's speeding up this trend that's been bubbling for a while now, something called de-dollarization, and it's exactly what it sounds like, a global effort to rely less on the US dollar. Just look at this chart. You can see the dollar's slice of the pie has been shrinking for 2 decades. This whole mess, it's like pouring gasoline on that fire. Leading that charge is the BRICS alliance. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And they have a pretty clear 3-step strategy. 1, trade more with each other using their own currencies. 2, build their own payment systems. And 3, stack up gold instead of US dollars. They're basically building a whole parallel financial universe that doesn't need the dollar to run. And a huge piece of that new universe is SIPS, which is China's payment system. It's designed to be a direct competitor to the SWIFT network we all know, which is controlled by the West and has been used to enforce sanctions. SIPS is still the smaller player, for sure, but it is growing fast, and it gives countries a way to do business internationally without ever having to touch the U.S. financial system. So you take all of this, the investigation, the political dogfight, the global reaction, and it all boils down to one single, incredibly important question about the future of money, and maybe the future of global power itself. You know, history has a funny way of repeating itself. The British pound used to be the currency, the top dog, right? But nothing lasts forever. And it makes you wonder, after a century of the US dollar running the show, could it be next? It's kind of wild to think that this whole investigation, focused on one guy and one building, might have just exposed some serious cracks in an entire economic empire. And the big question we're all left with is, can those cracks even be fixed?
All right, today we're jumping right into a massive confrontation. Think the world's most powerful central bank going head-to-head with the highest office in the land. This isn't just some political squabble, it's a battle that could shake the entire global economy.
Let's kick things off with this quote from Fed Chair Jerome Powell. I mean, just read it. This is not your typical carefully worded central banker talk. No way. This is someone basically drawing a line in the sand. It sets the stage perfectly for the fight we're about to break down.
And that line in the sand? Well, the conflict absolutely hit its boiling point on January 9th, 2026. All of a sudden, this stopped being a debate about policy. It wasn't just a war of words anymore. The Department of Justice actually served the Fed with grand jury subpoenas. We're talking about a full-blown legal crisis, and it was aimed right at the Fed chair himself.
So in this explainer, we're going to unpack this whole thing. A central bank literally under siege. And believe me, this story is about so much more than just interest rates. It really gets to the core of some fundamental principles like institutional independence and, the rule of law itself.
Okay, so the big question is, how on earth did we get here? I mean, a criminal investigation into the Federal Reserve? That's just wild. To really get it, we need to hit rewind and look at how the pressure just kept building and building over the last year.
This timeline really lays out the whole pressure campaign. It starts back in January 2025 with calls for zero interest rates. Then, you see in June, something that sounds totally boring. A testimony about a building renovation ends up being the excuse for the investigation later on. By August, they're trying to flat out remove a sitting governor. Then in October, a new, politically friendly appointee gets on the board, stirring things up from the inside. And boom, all of that leads us to the subpoenas in January and Powell's defiant response.
But to really get the why behind all this, I mean, this is an incredible amount of pressure. We have to dig into two key ideas that were really driving all of this. There's one political theory and one economic one.
First up, the political angle. It's all based on something called the unitary executive theory. Now, what's that? It's basically a legal argument that says the president should have direct control over the entire executive branch. And that includes agencies that have always been independent, like the Fed. This idea completely goes against the tradition that says, hey, the Fed needs to be independent to do its job without being swayed by short-term politics.
Okay, the second piece of the puzzle is an economic trap, and it's called fiscal dominance. Picture this. A country's debt gets so massive that the government literally cannot afford higher interest rates. What happens then? The central bank, in this case the Fed, basically loses its main weapon against inflation because it's forced to keep rates low just to stop a government debt crisis. Monetary policy effectively becomes a hostage to government spending.
And listen, this isn't just some abstract economic theory. Look at this number, $38 trillion. That's the U.S. national debt we're talking about. A number that big is what makes the threat of fiscal dominance so incredibly real. It creates this enormous underlying pressure to just keep interest rates down, low, no matter what the economy or inflation is actually doing. And that pressure, it's spilled right over into a huge policy fight inside the Fed itself. You can see the two sides here. On one hand, you have the Fed consensus, led by Powell. They're looking at a hot economy, 5.4% GDP growth, inflation still above target, and saying, hey, rates need to be between 3.5 and 4%. But then you have the new guy, Stephen Miran, who basically gives the political argument an academic voice. He's arguing that inflation isn't as bad as it looks, and that rates should be slashed all the way down to 2.5%.
So, you've got this massive battle going on in Washington.
But what did the rest of the world think? Well, global financial markets pretty much sounded the alarm. They cast a clear vote of no confidence.
Yeah, this quote really says it all, doesn't it? A sell America sentiment. I mean, the entire global financial system is built on trust in the U.S. and its institutions. And when that trust starts to crack, this is what happens. All of a sudden, the world's safest place to put your money doesn't look so safe anymore.
And this isn't just a feeling. There was a real-world cost. You can see it right here in this chart. This is the U.S. term premium. Think of it as the extra cash investors demand to hold on to long-term U.S. debt because of risk. For a while, it was actually negative. But look at that. It shot up to 0.85%. That's the market, in effect, slapping a brand new governance risk tax on the U.S. government, all because of this political chaos.
And it wasn't just private investors who were getting nervous. Check this out. Other countries started making moves. Their central banks started buying up gold at the fastest pace we've seen in modern history. That is a classic textbook move you make when you start losing faith in the world's main reserve currency. They were hedging their bets, diversifying away from the dollar because of the instability they were seeing in the U.S. So, where does all this leave the U.S. economy? I mean, you've got the Fed's credibility being questioned, you've got this massive debt. Well, analysts have basically mapped out 4 possible paths forward, and they are very, very different.
And this chart really shows you just how high the stakes are. The path with the highest probability, at 47%, is called austerity reform, and that means exactly what it sounds like, a painful period of spending cuts and tax hikes to try and tame the debt. The next most likely outcome, at 33%, is entrenched dominance, where the Fed basically loses the fight, leading to inflation that just won't go away. Then you have the riskier scenarios, a 15% chance of a global stagflation crisis, and, yeah, a tiny 5% chance of a perfect soft landing, where everything works out just fine.
Which brings us to this final, huge question. You know, the old saying is that the Fed's job is to take away the punch bowl just when the party's getting good, right? To stop the economy from overheating. But what happens when the partygoers themselves, the political system that loves all that easy money, try to grab the punch bowl and take it from the Fed? The answer to that question, well, it's going to define our economy for a very long time.